Benny Hinn, Catherine Coleman, Oral Roberts. Well, my personal favorite, and I say this with some sarcasm, was Rex Humbard. Anybody ever heard of Rex Humbard? Well, I grew up about 50 miles south of his Akron, Ohio Cathedral of Tomorrow. And he raised money by selling healing cloths and healing oil, and he especially targeted the older members of his congregation and his TV audience. And one of his spiels went like this, and I quote, "Rush this scripturally based faith handkerchief." Faith, you know how many times the Bible talks about faith handkerchiefs, right? Back to me. And when I get this faith handkerchief back from you with your name printed on it, I'm going to pray a special prayer for a special miracle for you. And I ask you right now to get out the largest bill or check that you have and give it to me for what we're doing for God through this ministry. Give it as an act of faith. That's the end of the quote. Miracles for sale. You know, maybe we could pay for our landscaping that way. Maybe we could get the piecers to make us some, no, okay. Locals called the cross-topped steeple of the cathedral the shaft that Rex Humbard gave Akron. So today we're looking at Elisha, not to be confused with Elijah. And Elisha was a different kind of a healer. He could heal somebody who didn't even have any faith. And he didn't need oil, he didn't need cloths, he didn't even need money. Elisha was not the typical prophet for hire. He was wild, he was unpredictable, he was crotchety, he was rude, and he was not afraid to speak truth to power. And 2 Kings has folk tales about Elisha, legends of these miraculous happenings, and the original audiences would have eaten this stuff up. These were stories about God making fools out of Israel's enemies. What they probably didn't appreciate so much was the flip side, because there's plot twist stories about outsiders. And in these stories, the so-called insiders looked pretty bad, while the outsiders were a lot more in line with what God had in mind. And Naaman was both. Starts out as an enemy, and then becomes one of those plot twist outsiders. He was a great man. He had a successful military career. He commanded Aram's army. Aram is Syria, by the way. And that army allowed Aram to dominate the whole region. And the king of Aram valued him so much that he personally intervened with the king of Israel to get Naaman healed. But it does come of something of a shock to read that Naaman owed his victory for Aram over Israel, to the God of Israel. So his high status depended on the victory given by the God of Israel, though it's doubtful that he would have seen it that way. But one issue marred Naaman's successful life. There was something going on with his skin. Now, as Andrew pointed out, some of the older translations call this leprosy. The Hebrew word doesn't mean Hansen's disease. In Hebrew, it's zarat, and we don't know exactly what it was. It was probably more than one condition. Walls and clothing could get it. But when you had zarat, you were socially ostracized. There was stigma involved, and possibly it even indicated divine displeasure, like this is a punishment for something that you've done. And it was very, very visible. Now, maybe some of Naaman's high social status blunted some of this social ostracism, but there's no doubt about it, he would have been embarrassed with this. And then this very humble person offered the cure to Naaman's healing. Raiding parties into Israel, possibly led by Naaman himself, had brought back a slave girl, an Israelite slave, to serve Naaman's wife. And the wording indicates that she was a little girl. This isn't just a disrespectful reference to a slave woman. Not that they would have had any qualms about disrespecting a slave woman, but this was a child. And this could be the biggest miracle in the whole story. Despite her captivity, the little girl had compassion. even for her owners. And she told her mistress that Naaman could be cured if he would see the prophet who lives in Samaria. Naaman must have been really desperate if he was willing to take this advice. She was the lowest of the low. She was the spoils of war. She was a slave. She was a foreigner. She was a female. And she was young. And the author doesn't even bother to tell us her name. But Naaman planned another trip to Israel. This time, though, he wasn't going as a conqueror. He was going as a diseased supplicant. First step, though, was to jump through all the hoops of international diplomacy. Naaman told his king what the girl had said. And the king responded the only way that he knew how, like a king, like someone used to getting his own way. Go, the king commanded, but he sent Naaman not to the prophet, but to the king of Israel. And he wrote a letter of introduction, and it was a letter of expectation. And Naaman left with his gold and silver. Apparently, he didn't realize that the prophets of the God of Israel didn't work for money. And he didn't realize that they weren't paid by the king. And he didn't realize that the king didn't even have any authority over them. So Naaman went to Israel and marched straight to the palace and handed the king the letter. Notice that neither of the kings are ever named either. Then immediately there was a diplomatic snafu. The king's letter, the letter was intended to calm the king of Israel. You know, we're not invading again. That's not what this is about. But instead, it really shook him up. The wording was ambiguous. I'm sending you my servant Naaman so you can cure him of his disease. Israel's king assumed he was being personally demanded to cure Naaman. He too thought like a king. And he assumed, well, he suspected, that Aram was looking for an excuse to renew the fighting. So we have some misunderstandings going on here. Fortunately, the prophet Elisha intervened and said, why don't you send him to me, and then he'll know that there's a prophet in Israel. The man who rolled up in front of Elisha's house that day with his boxes of silver and gold and fancy clothes, ready to buy a cure, he was used to honor and deference, and he was used to compliance, and it didn't go well. For starters, the prophet dishonored the great man. At least that's how Naaman would have seen it. The prophet didn't even show himself. He just sent a messenger and said, and then Naaman thought that the message itself was humiliating. It was sort of self-serve. Go down and bathe yourself in this third-rate, muddy river. So why did Elisha act like that? Maybe he was demonstrating that he wasn't a wonder worker who healed for money. I suspect he was just being a jerk. Elisha could be a jerk, but the Israelite audience would have loved it. Well, the general was insulted. I will not stand here and be treated like this. We are going home. But persuaded by his slaves, note slaves again, Naaman swallowed his pride and lowered his privileged but diseased body into the Jordan. And then after all that buildup, the actual healing is compressed into one verse. You know, we want details, but there are no details. Then Naaman came back to thank Elisha, who this time did come out and meet him. Naaman confessed his new faith in the God of Israel, and he offered Elisha the presents that he had brought. Another rebuff. Elisha made it clear the power of God is not for sale. This was a gift. This was grace. This was not the response of the typical court prophet for hire or the modern-day faith healer. So then Naaman asked to take some dirt home with him, to build an altar for Israel's God, now his God, in Damascus. And he requested that God forgive him for participating in the worship of Rimmon, the Assyrian version of the god Baal. But he knew he was going to have to do this because of his career responsibilities. He was going to have to make this an imperfect situation. And Elisha simply said, "Shalom," and Naaman left with his dirt. So what do we do with this? We could do a lot of things. But first I want to emphasize the main point of the story. The main points are to, one, demonstrate the importance of the prophets of the God of Israel, but even more, to demonstrate the power of the God of Israel, the God of Jesus, the God of Parkside. This God could have Naaman defeat his own people, then afflict him with a disease that obviously caused him a lot of distress, and then heal him. This God, the prophets insist, is all powerful, and that's the point. But there are subpoints, and subpoints, and subpoints. And I'm going to talk about one of those subpoints today, but we mustn't lose track of the main narrative, the power of God. So what are the subpoints? Well, accommodationism, humility, social and political power or the lack thereof, healing, slavery, war, faith, risk-taking, multiple loyalties, conversion, prophets, grace, exclusion, ethnocentricity, and a major interest of the Jews at the time, how do you worship God in a foreign land? We could have a sermon on any one of these. So how long do you want to be here? The cured life for Naaman was going to be a challenge. He was plunged into a danger that was maybe even greater than the disease that he'd just been cured of. He was plunged into the territory of multiple loyalties. Did his new faith automatically mean he was going to be in trouble all the time? He'd either be in trouble with the jealous God of Israel or he'd be in trouble with his infuriated master. Naaman needed a pardon for a compromise he knew was not going to be perfect. His new belief, like our belief, means siding with the God of the underdog, the poor, the homeless, the mentally and physically disabled. Not easy stuff for the privileged. What was his king going to say? How was he going to work this out? And we face similar situations. Which compromises are possible and which compromises are betrayals of our faith? Every faithful person who doesn't just abandon the world and go live in a monastery or a nunnery has to face the issue of divided loyalties. And there's no easy answer that works every time. You know, the piously rigid and the obsessively pure have always hated Elisha's response to Naaman. Go in peace. They want something more emphatic. But Elisha didn't approve. He didn't judge. He just said, go and live your life the best that you can. The best that we can, just like Judah's exiles living in a foreign land away from God's temple. Just like early Christians who were pressured to offer incense to various Roman emperors. Just like 21st century Californians up against the greed of capitalism. How much compromise is too much? Let's imagine a different scenario. Suppose the little slave girl had had the affliction. Suppose she mentioned to her masters that a prophet in her home country could cure her. How likely is it that she, no privilege, no financial resources, would have been able to access that health care available through the prophet? Now, I'm not saying God won't heal a poor person. The Bible shows God doing miracles all the time. But for this particular healing, Naaman had to go to Elisha. Effective health care meant having connections. It meant having the money to get there. No trip to Israel to Elisha, no cure. Now, some of you might be thinking, wait a minute, why are you talking about health care? Why aren't you talking about what God did? Why aren't you emphasizing what God does? I am. God did heal Naaman, but God worked through the slaves. God worked through Elisha to create the opportunity for that cure. They were God's people, and God used them. So, as God's people, living in the United States in 2024, maybe we should be asking, how does God want to work through us to make the opportunity to be cured available to everyone, regardless of their socioeconomic standing? Don't we want Naaman's slave to have the same access to health care that he had? Now, privilege doesn't protect us from health problems. We are all vulnerable to illness, and we at Parkside are so painfully aware of that right now. And access to and payment for health care are complicated issues, and I don't pretend to know how to work all this out. But what I do know is that the person with resources has a much better chance of surviving a medical crisis than the person without those resources, and a much better chance of thriving afterwards. Nothing highlights the gap between the haves and the have-nots quite like health care. And sadly, as a nation, we can't even decide if it's a privilege or a right. Let's look at some of the differences between the haves and the have-nots. Every year in the United States, 530,000 households file for bankruptcy. 2/3 of those are for medical bills that they can't pay. About 27 million non-elderly individuals are uninsured, and 1 in 5 of those 27 million won't seek the health care that they need because they can't pay for it. In low-income areas, methods of transportation can be really unreliable, and it makes it really hard to get to the appointment. Chronic diseases and disabilities require long-term management. So people without resources, they don't get the dialysis. They don't get their prescriptions refilled. They don't get physical therapy. They don't even go to the dentist. And the list goes on. Adults with health care aren't immune from worrying about health care costs either. We still have to worry about the deductibles. We still have to worry about the monthly premiums. And sometimes those are really high. About half of the United States adults say it's difficult to afford health care costs. So often, they don't. And did you know that doctors don't have to take Medicare, Medicaid? That's Medi-Cal to us. So even if you have it, research shows that while 93%, I know there's a lot of numbers here, but they're staggering, 93% of primary care doctors theoretically accept Medicare, but only about 70% of them are taking new patients. And specialists are even less likely to take Medicare. And same for Medicaid, same percentage accepting. And then studies show these patients aren't treated fairly when they do get there. They're denied treatment, they experience longer waits for appointments, far longer waits for referrals, they aren't listened to, they have their concerns discounted, and it's worse, much worse for Black and Hispanic people. See, Naaman isn't the only one whose illness made him desperate. We saw Naaman lose his identity. We saw him become a nobody, and we saw him feel foolish and desperate at the same time, and he almost left unhealed because it overwhelmed him. Just like it overwhelms so many people in our society today. And, being treated as a non-entity by rude or busy practitioners, and then being subjected to strange procedures where you didn't have a voice and that nothing was explained. This is very much the stuff of life on the other side of the have-not divide. Centuries later, the memory of this healing just infuriated Jesus' contemporaries. When he preached at the synagogue in Nazareth, Jesus said, "There were also many persons with skin diseases in Israel during the time of the prophet Elisha, but none of them were cleansed. Instead, Naaman the Syrian was cleansed. And just a reference almost brought a very precipitous end to Jesus' career. The locals were going to kill him just for saying it. Privilege is fiercely guarded. Parkside, do we have a problem with privilege? Well, we probably do because we're human and privilege is tough to let go of. So, what's the cure? Well, keep working at it, obviously. Be aware, be woke, be compassionate, be willing to share. But I think our biggest problem right now, when it comes to privilege in healthcare, is to prepare ourselves for the battle that lies ahead. Even when we're shaking inside, we stand up for the rights of the marginalized. The need for that is not going to go away anytime soon. We're going to have to live with an imperfect compromise, but we can't compromise enough to compromise our faith, to compromise what we know is right. The prayers, and we pray a lot, and the prayers of God's people are often answered not through the power brokers, not through the ones with power and with privilege, but they're answered because our very powerful God moves in us, in all of us. And justice comes through those whose only power is in our numbers and in our willingness to stand up for what's right. This is the year of elections. And I know there are so many important issues, and we, like Naaman, are going to have to make some compromises. None of us will get everything we want. But as we go into this election year, let's make sure we know what issues involve health care. Let's make sure we know candidates' stances on good health care for the people who lack it. We want the slave girl to have the same access to health care as Naaman, right? We want a cure. Amen.